Assalamu alaikum. This is Ali Farooq again, and we are here still with Dr. Shehzad Saleem. And what a pleasure it was to understand his journey in the first episode. And Shehzad Bhai and I have not only we're spending time in Dallas, we have some good background of spending time in Singapore. So I got to learn a lot, and we would like to use these episodes to learn more about him, and then eventually understand his perspectives and learn from him as well as part of these four series that we're talking about. So Shehzad Bhai, welcome back.
Thank you.
We were talking, and I kind of got embedded in the story about how you eventually met Javed Ahmed Ghamidi Saab. So I would like to know and focus this episode morely on your journey with Javed Saab. How did you thought that he was one of the person you want to follow or listen to? And I will ask my questions together, and then maybe you can answer. And then also, what do you think of Javed Saab? And meanwhile, as you're explaining, also continue talking about your journey as part of Al-Mawrid US, and eventually something that led to your PhD.
Okay, so I think that very earlier on, when I was in my engineering studies, and I had also made up my mind to study religion. And this was the time when I got introduced to Ustaz Ghamidi, and he very kindly offered me, after I remember taking a very subtle test, whether I qualify or not. And later on, he told me that it was like a test, and he actually asked me to read a book. I still remember it was Ghubare Khatir of Abul Kalam Azad. He wanted to check if I had any literary taste or not, because the way he and his predecessors think is that unless you have a literary appreciation of classical Arabic or of language itself, whether it's Urdu or English, you just cannot proceed to become a student of the Quran. So I remember him checking me, which I later realized. And so one fine day, when I turned up to him, he said that, well, if you would like to, because I had already expressed my desire, I'd like to study Islam more. And he said that, okay, if that is the case, then come over to me. I literally was very happy. And I remembered, because I studied literature a lot, and I remember Shakespeare in Julius Caesar saying that there is a tide in the affairs of men, which when taken at the flood, leads on to good fortune. So I thought that I had stumbled upon that famous Shakespearean tide, and it was like a dream come true, and I didn't need to go anywhere and go right to him to study. And in the meantime, of course, I had read about him. I knew that he was a tremendous scholar in his own right. So I jumped on the opportunity, and I said, yes, okay, that is fine. And then I remember come to him every day without fail in the evenings. So once I was done with my engineering studies in the morning and my other tasks, I remember I used to take a bus from the place that I used to live and change 2 buses to go to him.
In Lahore?
In Lahore.
So he was in Mall Town?
He was in Mall Town, and we used to live in Chauburji.
Chauburji, okay.
So that is a fair distance. Multan Road. So I had to take 2 buses, and it took me an hour or more than that at times. But I think very religiously I used to go there almost every day, except if there was some incident. And so he said that, and he started teaching us. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be at times taught singly by him. But another thing which happened was that the time that I decided to come to him and study, it was just a sheer stroke of luck that there were some other gentlemen, and you might be knowing them. For example, Moiz Amjad and Asif Iftikhar, two very brilliant colleagues of mine. It was around about the same time that their journeys also led them in different ways to Ghamidi Saab. So they were there. I mean, it was like almost the same time that they were also coming to him. And so we had a couple of people from which a class could be made, and we could teach, and we could be taught. And I think there were some other people as well. And so I remember that Ghamidi Saab actually deputed one of his very senior students and respected students, Talib Mohsen Saab, and another of his students, Rafi Mufti Saab, to teach us, the 3 of us, Arabic language and related disciplines. And as far as the Quran and some other disciplines were concerned, he would actually leave them to us not by teaching us, but making us ask questions, giving us certain challenging questions or passages, and then trying to teach us not through any formal teaching, but by making us go through those texts and then coming to him and answering those questions. So this is how we started. And very soon I realized that it would be very difficult for me to complete my engineering, because if I have to, I was so deep into religious studies that I was completely neglecting my engineering studies. And at one point of time, I actually told my teacher that said, I think there's no use studying the rest of the 6 months that I have, and I'd like to start immediately. I'd like to come to you and, study in the morning as well, because this was like an evening thing that was. And I remember he said very sternly that I must finish my studies. So at that time, I did not like his answer. But later on, I did realize that it was a world of good that he did to me. Otherwise, I had ended up wasting my 5 years, because being very near to my degree and then just abandoning my degree would have been, it was a waste of time as well. So on his push and on his tremendous, I would say, emphasis and stress, I continued my engineering, and it was then that I finished in the next 6 months. And then actually I was given sort of a job at Al-Mawrid, and the job was that I was to publish a journal, which I am still publishing, and it's now 32 years old as well.
Mashallah.
So in fact, in January of 1990, we started this Renaissance journal, which is now online and has completed 32 years, in which I would translate a lot of material from Urdu, from Tadabbur-e-Quran, from Ghamidi Saab's Al-Bayan, from Ghamidi Saab's Mizan.
And his articles.
And also try to do a little my own ranting as well. So this is how that journey started. And Renaissance itself owes its inception to another stalwart of Al-Mawrid, who also unfortunately passed away in COVID, Altaf Mahmood Saab. So he, through his own pocket, he sponsored that journal, and he would have it printed all the time, every month. And I was paid through that journal as well. And that journal had its attachment to Al-Mawrid. And Al-Mawrid at that time actually had another name, and it was called Darul Ishraq. So that was a forerunner, I would say, to Al-Mawrid, the predecessor to Al-Mawrid. Because when we joined Ghamidi Saab's circle, Al-Mawrid had already been put into abeyance. It had started in 1983, but around in 1986, because of certain reasons, it was, abandoned or at least put into abeyance. So when we came to him in 1990, this chance of reviving Al-Mawrid once again, and then having those classes that we had in the evening to be conducted in the morning in the form of a formal institute, that thing actually materialized. And Altaf Mahmood Saab, he was the person who made it possible through his resources. He was the sole financer, the first person. And there were other people as well, but primarily it was him. So in 1990, the three of us, Asif, Moiz, and myself, and then of course we had some other people as well who wanted to study. I do remember that Dr. Sajid Hamid Sahab, he was was doing his master's degree, I think, at that time. And he had just finished, and so he was a senior to us as well. So he also joined our study in certain classes. But you see, our classes were of two planes. The language part, primarily it was the three of us. But then the rest of the studies in which we would be studying Islam or questioning, we had a larger class. We had a larger group of people. And from 1990 to 1994, we actually introduced a semester system at Al-Mawrid, and we studied. Every 6 months we would study certain books, and there would be an exam or an assessment, and that assessment would primarily revolve around the amount of work that we would have done, because it was like an on-job training. So we had studies and on-job assignments as well. Yeah. So that continued for 3 or 4 years, and then of course in 1999, what happened was that we got this opportunity that we could educate people and give them graduate degrees. And the chance arrived when Mia Amir Mahmood, you might be knowing him, so he opened up a university in Karachi, I think still functioning. It's called the M.A. Jinnah University, the Muhammad Ali Jinnah University.
Yes, it is there.
It is there. So we actually now are in a position to offer degree-oriented classes, because all of us had got, we had been trained formally, and we could teach others the way we were taught. So that happened in 1999, somewhere in 1999, and we got an affiliation with that university. So Al-Mawrid had an affiliation with that university in Karachi. It was an interprovincial affiliation in which we offered 2 years, 3 years of master's classes. So 1 year was a preparatory year in which we would teach Arabic and some of the basic disciplines. And the next 2 years would be proper Arabic and Quran-oriented and Hadith-oriented. All those disciplines were taught. But in 2001 or 2002, what happened was we had turned out about 2 or 3 batches by that time, that the government of Pakistan introduced a law that you cannot have an interprovincial link. So if you have to have a link with an accredited institution, it must be in your own province. And that link, unfortunately, could not have worked. And the second thing that we also realized was that we were not getting good students as well, because people who would not be getting admissions in Masters of Islamic Studies in reputed universities, the leftovers would come to us, and the amount of exertion we would do in teaching them, and I mean, I will not disparage them in any way, but to be honest, they were people who might have done better if they had done something else. They were not made at times for Islamic studies, but still, in spite of that, I think in the first batch we got some very bright students in the first batch. But what I'm talking about, that this deteriorated in the third batch. So the first two batches, the students that we got were exceptionally good, I think.
Yes.
And they were the ones who were there in the making,
yes.
and you were just giving that opportunity. But by the time we reached the third batch or the fourth batch, the students that we started to get were very average. And at the same time, we had this huge challenge that we could not have been affiliated.
Yeah, yes.
So we abandoned that program in 2003 and 2002. And it was at round about this time when I got an opportunity to do my PhD. And the thing that happened was that I was leading that educational program. And one of the pluses of that educational program would be that if a person has a degree or a PhD degree in engineering, in any religious subject, would be a big plus. So I got this admission from the University of Wales in a topic that I was very interested in, which is the history of the Quran, which has another interesting story behind it. Yeah. And I started off my PhD in 2002, I think, January 2002. And it was I was to be based in Lahore because in the UK PhDs they don't require any coursework. This is the course.
Research,
it's just a research. And when I talked to my instructor, and he knew that I had Ghamidi Sahib available to me, and of course when I wrote that proposal, somehow maybe he thought that I have ample guidance available here, and he himself was there as well. So he said that I don't need to come to him immediately, and the proposal that I gave him was approved immediately. And also, I didn't have a master's degree because I was an electrical engineer, and that's a graduate. I mean, that's I would say an undergrad degree in the modern sense, but a graduate degree in the Pakistani sense. So somehow, I don't know how I got that admission in spite of not having a master's degree, like a BS degree.
It's just a longer PhD sometimes.
So it was a longer PhD, exactly. Yes. So it was like 6 years. In fact, it was the time that I got was 6 to 9 years, minimum of 6 and a maximum of 9. So I started doing my PhD on the history of the Quran, which actually was a new chapter in my life, and it started off with again with an incident.
And we are going to talk about it in the next episode, because that is a very special thing that you bring to Al-Mawrid and to the people in the world. I would like to firstly kind of quickly recap and then also have a few more questions follow up on that. So it looks like from 86, 87 to 88 time frame, you were more getting linked with Ustad Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. And then after that, you started working closely to get educated. And since I also had the opportunity to meet Ustad Javed Ghamidi quite a lot, I know about his the way he tries to know the people about the critical thinking, about their liking to literature, so that because it's all about academics, right? So you talked about that, and but you also talked about that you had to learn Arabic, you had to learn some foundational basics of the deen that some of his other disciples were also helping you to learn. And then 1990 to 1994, it looks like you were really in the learning phase.
Studies,
And after that, you became more like full-time employees, and also we were in a position to teach. So we were also offered during this time certificate courses through our own institute. Before we entered that degree phase, so in the earlier period, we had this opportunity to give courses in evening regarding Islam to various walks of life to people. Yeah, and it looks like, because just for the audience here, that Dr. Shehzad also runs as director for education for Al-Mawrid US. So the background that you shared with us goes a long way, because you already have not just the PhD, but you have about 8 years in rough calculation of teaching experience directly affiliated with the university from 95 to 2003.
Right. So not only that, I think I was more involved in running the affairs of the institute, Al-Mawrid. So that actually started in 1990. So I was the first administrator, I would say, of the institute, and all the way up to 2015. So it's like 25 years of administration and organization and helping, because Ustaz Ghamidi was the president and I was the, you can say the administrative head. to some extent. I was answerable to him, but at the same time, it was like all administration was something which was looked after by me, and academics were looked after by him. So from 1990 to 2015, these 25 years, I worked with him, and while he was looking at these affairs of academics, I was looking at the organization, and teaching was going in side by side, parallel, and doing research work.
And we know that you also helped with a lot of translation, a lot of books that you wrote. So there's a whole journey which you helped us sum up in less than 12-13 minutes. But before we end this episode, Shehzad bhai, a couple of things I really want to understand, and one of them is, like why would a student like yourself, who's already talking to such a great scholar as Dr. Asrar, we obviously can have disagreements, but he was a very learned scholar, and starting from there, and what are the other definitive things that you want to share with the audience, that maybe it is the teaching methodology, maybe it is the reasoning, I don't know, I'm just giving examples just to help understand my question. What made you kind of really go on with your journey with Al-Mawrid and with Javed Ahmed?
Well, I think this is a very good question, and I have thought about this question, and I think the answer that my inner self gave to me was that I was more interested towards pure learning as to activism. So you see, Dr. Asrar Saab combined activism and learning, and the activism part was more than the learning part. So it's like bringing about an Islamic revolution and working in the society and having those placards and processions and protests, etc. So it was like he was more of an activist, and knowledge was something. I mean, they were secondary, I would say, or they served the purpose of that activism. And I was, more of a person who relished learning per se. Yeah. So this is something which I found with Ghamidi Saab and the FIRESIDE school, as I have come to know it, that learning for the sake of learning, going deep into the Quran, and instead of having an external agenda, the best thing would be that you learn and then you impart the thing that you have learned. So teaching and research.
Shehzad bhai, this is a very good point. I just want to emphasize on that, because after spending some time with you, and especially a lot with Ustad Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, the sense of academic work on Deen, rises on top of my head, because yes, there is Deen that you need to understand, but when you look at it academically, it's a different ball game, and that's probably the reason, and tell me if I'm right, is why a lot of work happened behind the scenes. Ustad Javed Ghamidi started coming more to the forefront in late 2009, 2008, but there was all these 40 years of academic work trying to really academically look at it, and it's just a better understanding of Deen, not about any activism or pan-Islamism or anything like that.
So you see, this journey actually begins with Ustaz's teacher's teacher, Ustaz Hamid Farai. He passed away in 1930, which is almost now a century ago. And his own life, he remained a professor or a teacher all his life. So his own life was based on studying the Quran, delving deep into the language of the Quran, coming up with a beautiful tafsir, although he couldn't finish it, but a tafsir, partly a tafsir of the Quran, and the principles of understanding the Quran itself, the text of the Quran. And these were actually further developed by his student Amin Hassan Islahi, who was able to spend about 5 years with him, the last 5 years of his life, FIRESIDE Saab's life, from 1925 to 1930. So Islahi lived with him the way a shadow, pursues the body. So he was right behind him, right after him, all the time with him. And he learned these disciplines, and he was very young at that time, he was 25 years old. And this left a huge impact, a huge imprint on his mind. So although he joined the Jamaat-e-Islami on the invitation of Maududi Saab, but soon in 1958 he left the Jamaat for various reasons, and then he concentrated to write that Tadabbur-e-Quran, the 9-volume masterpiece. So from 1958 to 1980, which was 22 years, he finished his tafsir in August of 1980. And so that was the time in which he actually expounded the principles which were set forth by his illustrious Ustaz Hamid Farahi, and he was not just copying them or not just elaborating upon them. He also made some original contributions while actually elaborating the Quran and explaining the Quran. And if I remember correctly, Ghamidi Sahib has told us that in 1973, when Islahi Sahib was teaching Surah Zukhruf, which is the 43rd Surah of the Quran, this was a time when Ghamidi Sahib joined Islahi Sahab's circle, so in 1973. So what you're saying actually is that it's like a century-old work, which was at the back of Ghamidi Sahab's own mind, and of course his own contribution, which was no less than, as I said, merely expounding the principles of his two illustrious predecessors, but also some original contributions. So this, with this in background and this in mind, it was in 2005, if you remember, when General Pervez Musharraf Sahab was at the helm of affairs of Pakistan, that we had this opening up of channels, a lot of private channels opening up. So that was the time when Ustaz decided that whatever he has researched so far and learned so far, he would come on public media and explain. So you know very well that there were different programs and different private channels in which there were discussions, there were debates, there were critical elements as well. So that was the time in 2005 when he started off. And by the way, I was one of his biggest critics at that time. I said that this is not the right time for us to plunge into this public arena because still a lot of academic work has to be accomplished, and we might sacrifice that if we do this.
So yeah, I agree. I mean, I heard the story, and it's all about, you know, great leaders, great scholars can also think ahead of time, right? Because Ustad Javed Ahmed Ghamidi knew this was a time, and he told us a story about how difficult it was to recite based on the academic work that was also very good that was happening. But eventually, all these 100 years of effort, you know, it's not just his effort, but it's also Amin Asad Aslai's effort. It's also Amin Adin Farai's effort, which started at the same time around when Maulana Maududi was also rising. And in parallel, there's a lot of work that was happening in place, and they all worked together with Maulana Maududi as well. So that had to come to forefront, and that's why here we are talking, you know. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about this, but I want to wrap up this episode so that we keep the content within these 20-25 minutes. But Shehzad bhai, thank you so much. And we'll come back together very soon on the next version, and we'll talk about his PhD and his access to history of Quran, and also understand from him a little bit more about Javed Sahab and his relationship with Javed Sahab. Thank you very much.